Moving on, but sticking on that same Guardian article for a second, the article also mentions that Russia and Ukraine are major wheat producers, which, as you guys know, is also not good for the world right now. And the article says, in quotes, they also account for about 45% of rapeseed, which is imported to the UK to make cooking oil, and more than a fifth of maize products, which are used for animal feed and biofuels. So that's a whole other problem as well. And so this may be the only beginning, right? Because I want to turn to the one ingredient mentioned above, which is wheat and other grain products, right? While Iceland and other Western countries, have been able to shift to other products and raise prices, there's a lot of worries that in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, they're not going to be able to be as flexible here. And they could face just a mega famine due to their reliance on grain from Russia and Ukraine. And the fact that they've seen a mega drought that has hurt their own outputs and yields of wheat and other grains for the last couple of years. So if you have droughts and famines already happening because of climate change, and now you also have a global shortage because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's sub-Saharan Africa and other places like that that are going to be the recipients of the majority of this pain. Now, before we get into the current issue, over a month ago, before the invasion was even at its worst, kind of in the beginning days of it, the UN had already warned that Africans were facing a huge risk of drought, displacement, and famine. And this was from climate change, which, as we've discussed, is a major issue in creating political instability, as well as political instability and even food insecurity. An article from March in NBC News discusses how tens of millions of people across Africa face the risk of famine, drought, disease, and displacement within decades. And that's according to this apparently just landmark United Nations climate report, which was released in February. And it forecasts just a dire future for the continent. And of course, the continent that is going to be hit the most is one of the least responsible for climate change and global warming. Always ironic how that works. The article notes that GDP per capita for 1991 to 2000 in Africa was on average 13.6% lower compared to what it would have been if climate change had not occurred. In quotes here it said, impacts manifest largely through losses in agriculture, as well as tourism, manufacturing, and infrastructure. So again, climate change is hurting the country, and they actually could have yielded more crops, which obviously would have helped the entire continent's GDP as well. And like I said, they're not a major greenhouse polluter, but one of the biggest recipients of climate change related issues. And so the reason I'm mentioning this first is because even before the war in Ukraine, Africa's already been facing famine, drought, disease, and displacement. And now, to move ahead to the current issues Africa may be facing, it is important to actually note that Africa, especially places like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Liberia, and Kenya, are major producers and exporters of a myriad of different wheat products. And however, since 2011, there's been just this constant drop in the amount of grain and wheat they've exported. And Global Trade magazine notes that in 2017, approximately 27 million tons of wheat were produced in Africa. Yet this actually is kind of a flat line since about 2011, where the growth somewhat has stagnated. But before 2011, Africa was even producing more. But since then, we are seeing some massive droughts as well as locust swarms that have really ruined crops. And I think we're going to see that probably get worse. And so they're going to be more and more reliant on importing grain and wheat from other parts of the world. And now, as I'm going to mention in a minute, that could be problematic as we're seeing a huge global reduction in what they're requiring. It should also be noted that Africa right now relies on grain and wheat from places like China, Ukraine, and Russia. Also, to add a little more context, Africa's seen this huge drop, and also China's seen a drop over the last year because of climate change. So this issue is just compounding as we go. And this is obviously coming at a bad time. So according to an article from the National Geographic from I think it was yesterday, Ukraine and Russia together produce nearly 30% of the world's traded wheat, and it says in quotes, 12% of its calories. Without them, soaring food prices and shortages could touch off a wave of instability the world hasn't seen since the Arab Spring of 2012. The war has all but shut down grain exports from both countries. End quotes. Now, I've seen in other studies that the number could be closer to 20% of the world's traded wheat. I saw that in a UC Davis study. However, let's just say that, Russia's oil only makes up about 10% of the market. And it caused speculative chaos in our future oil markets, right? Now think that Russia and Ukraine produce around a quarter of the world's wheat, and maybe even more than a quarter of the world's wheat. Oil and natural gas is one thing. Food is a whole other thing. And if overnight, almost a third of our global wheat and grain is not able to be exported from that region, think about the chaos that could create. To continue on in the fun, the Council on Foreign Relations has an article from March 16th called East Africa's Growing Food Crisis, and it paints a worrying picture of basically what could be coming. It discusses how the Horn of Africa, so countries like Eritrea, Somalia, and Ethiopia, may face a very severe food crisis. The article discusses how even last month, the World Food Program indicated that some 13 million people across these countries, including Kenya as well, face severe hunger. To make this issue even more depressing, the article notes that the Food and Agricultural Organization has warned that over the course of 2022, 15 to 20 million people in those countries could face serious food insecurity. It also says, in quotes here, at the same time, the UN Children's Fund warned that more than 5 million children whose physical and cognitive development can be permanently damaged by inadequate nutrition may be impacted. End quotes. And, that is just bleak. It is just always the world's most vulnerable that are impacted here. And the article discusses how already climate change and supply chain disruptions from the pandemic have impacted food insecurity in many parts of Africa. It also mentions what I had earlier about how many parts of sub-Saharan Africa were experienced just atrocious locust swarms that just decimated cropland. And then, of course, the other icing on the cake here that I have covered in older episodes is the Ethiopian Civil War, or the Tigray crisis in Ethiopia, that's led to just famine-like conditions for just hundreds of thousands of Tigrayans up in that northeastern part. And this is in large part because the Ethiopian government has severely restricted or just outright denied humanitarian access. I actually wrote a piece almost a year ago, probably now, about how there were reports of Eritrean forces and Ethiopian forces just withholding aid and food, and people were just starving and they weren't caring. So now imagine that gets worse with even more climate change, more droughts, and a shortage, now a global shortage of what is required by these people. So it's going to get really worse. The Council on Foreign Relations also cites a number that's not good at all. It discusses how the World Food Program buys more than half of the wheat to help the vulnerable from Ukraine. So basically what they do is they buy wheat and distribute it around the world. And about 50% of that comes from Ukraine. It says here in quotes, supplies will be squeezed and prices will rise, including for fuel, which will make transporting food in the region even more expensive. And, obviously this is just worrying because it can lead to political unrest and violence as well as just starvation and humanitarian crises across the region. We have to think, right? Sudan's civil war, I would say probably was caused by a rise in bread prices, which happened in 2018, and that sparked the protests that ultimately brought down Omar al-Bashir's government. Obviously, he's not a great guy, but that's a whole other conversation here, right? When people can't eat, things can happen inside of a country. I would also make the case that the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS in Syria was intensified by famine and drought, right? As farmers were forced to go to the cities to look for work because their farms that were just not profitable anymore, they were instead radicalized by jihadist groups such as ISIS, and desperation kicked in a lot of parts, right? World leaders know that for a stable society, the people need to be eating. I just worry that this also leads to the rise of demagogues, a rise in mass violence, and the Ukraine crisis is just making all of this worse. So I wish Putin was listening to the podcast, but since I'm also your, broker of bad news here, I might as well mention even more chaos related to this issue, just for fun, of course. Apparently the floods in China over the last year have made crop production difficult, and the Chinese output of many of these crops has dropped as well. So Bloomberg has an article from last week that discusses, in quotes here, more extreme weather caused by rising global temperatures, compounded by geopolitical turmoil and pandemic, is hindering China's effort to ensure food supplies for its 1.4 billion people. End quotes. And China is a big producer, for example, of soybeans, wheat, and corn. Apparently, China, under Xi Jinping, really wanted to build their global exportation of some of these crops, and it actually led to a huge global surplus in these crops. So that's going to be a problem for everyone as well. And a segment from the article discusses a conversation with Tang Renjin, who is China's agricultural minister. And he says, in quotes, that China faces big difficulties in food production because of the unusual floods last autumn. He said in Beijing last month that many farming experts and technicians told us that the crops this year could be the worst in history. So, just to add more fun to this, right? I don't think Russia could have invaded Ukraine at a worse time, selfishly speaking, for the world and the food crises that we are facing. And I should also remind you, just as a side note about this, is that basically the social contract in China is that Mr. Xi here will help build a middle class and create stability, but the people just can't challenge his more draconian policies, his surveillance state, and his illiberal democracy. And, you know, we've seen over the last few weeks, there's been a collapse in the zero COVID policy, there's been a collapse in controlling COVID, and now with these crop shortages, what will happen if the Chinese government can't promise stability? I think it's worrying. I think it's very worrying. Because Xi Jinping, I mean, I guess you could say it's not worrying in a sense because maybe it could lead to change, but it could also lead to more draconian measures.